Red alert. Red alert.
This week's cartoon shows a number of commonly known myths. We have our classic alien invaders with saucer ships, but sadly no anal probes. We have the Loch Ness monster swimming in some wonderfully drawn water. Looks like someone just learned the gradient tool in Photoshop. We have a one-armed ghost of grandma. We have Bigfoot, or a poor drawing of a snowboarder. And then we have the most terrifying thing of them all, a Christian woman. The basic concept is this. All of these things and creatures are believed to exist because people have claimed to have seen them. But we know these things aren't real, right? So then why would we assume the resurrection of Jesus is any different? Heck, at least we have fake photos of these other creatures. Jesus doesn't even have that going for him. So if we're so quick to dismiss these other creatures, why do Christians adhere to the myth of Christ? But before we get into that, I do find it interesting that people are skeptical of other people's claims of alien encounters despite believing that aliens do exist. There is a large part of the scientific community and general population overall that are convinced with 100% certainty that there are extraterrestrial life forms in our universe, despite no direct evidence of such, which kind of sounds like something else I know of. Yet, if anyone says they've encountered an alien, they're immediately considered crazy. So, aliens exist way far away, that's a fact. But if you think they've come to Earth, you're an idiot. Makes perfect sense. And as for Loch Ness, what the creature really represents is an extinct animal that's been found to be alive. Crazy, right? Except for the fact that we find formerly extinct animals pretty often. I'm not saying Nessie is real, but I am saying that it's not far-fetched to find ancient creatures thought to be extinct, well, still alive. Okay, back to the main point. The goal of the cartoon is to make a dig on Christians who believe in a similar myth, Jesus Christ. But is the story of Christ's resurrection really the same as these other myths? After all, the story of Christ takes place in a completely different part of the world over 2,000 years ago, meaning there is no video or photography capable of confirming the claim of the resurrection as are commonly used to support these other myths. Without this format of direct evidence available to analyze, the only thing left are the eyewitness accounts of the people who were there at the time. So we can only compare the eyewitness accounts of the resurrection to these other myths to see if the story of Christ is any different from these other myths. Though this may be hard because the resurrection of Christ is one isolated event, whereas the likes of alien abductions and ghost encounters happen much more frequently, apparently. The first point to consider is one of doubt. We tend to think that we enlightened individuals of modern society are the first to doubt Christ's resurrection, but the first doubters are actually Christ's disciples themselves. The witnesses of the resurrection were at the time of Christ's death fully convinced Christ had died and was now gone. Thus we would naturally expect strong skepticism from the disciples when reports began to trickle in that Christ had risen from the dead, and this is exactly what we do read. The disciples continually did not believe the testimony of those that claim they saw Jesus. To me, this is a very important line of evidence in the authenticity of the gospel accounts because it shows the same logical thought that any rational skeptic today would have upon hearing of a dead man's resurrection. Then again, with so many zombie nation people out there, maybe people wouldn't be as doubtful these days. But other than initial doubt, what follows is even more profound. That such skeptics would immediately do a 180-degree turn and begin boldly preaching of their risen Messiah. This is our second point, that the doubters immediately transition to preaching earnestly of their resurrected master. This is, in fact, the one thing that the famous philosopher David Hume, a strong critic and skeptic of Christianity, found to be the most convincing evidence of Christ's resurrection. He wrote, "We have testimony to the effect that the disciples were exceedingly depressed at the time of the crucifixion, that they had extremely little faith in the future, and that, after a certain time, this depression disappeared, and they believed that they had evidence that their master had risen from the dead." Now, none of these alleged facts is in the least odd or improbable, and we have therefore little ground for not accepting them on the testimony offered us. But having done this, we are faced with the problem of accounting for the facts which we have accepted. What caused the disciples to believe, contrary to their previous conviction, and in spite of their feeling of depression, that Christ had risen from the dead? Clearly, one explanation is that he actually had risen. And this explanation accounts for the fact so well that we may at least say that the indirect evidence for the miracle is far and way stronger than the direct evidence. To Hume, it is the very change in behavior among the disciples, from depressed doubters to highly motivated evangelists, that provides the strongest evidence for Christ's resurrection. We see this with Peter, who denied Christ 3 times when confronted with life-threatening opposition. Yet after witnessing the resurrected Christ, we find him weeks later risking his life preaching the gospel in the same place where just weeks before he couldn't even bring himself to acknowledge that he knew Christ. We see further evidence of this with Saul, who spent much of his life hunting down Christians, do a complete 180 upon being visited by Christ, and becoming not only a Christian, but spending the rest of his life spreading the gospel, setting up churches, and being beaten, jailed, and executed for it. It doesn't make much sense for a person who had already made the prior judgment that the story of Christ was false, which is the next point to contemplate. The third point is one of motivation and rationale, as in there is no motivation to make such claims that Christ had risen from the dead, and therefore no reason to waste time and risk your life trying to convince others the same. Yet we see a wholesale attempt by those who witnessed the resurrection to do these things. What motivation did the disciples have for concocting this lie? They surely would not financially prosper from it, as they had already left their lives behind to follow Jesus. Lastly, and most obviously, would the disciples have willingly sacrificed themselves for something they knew to be untrue? All but 2 of the original 12 disciples were killed for their beliefs. It is one thing to die for something you believe to be true. It is quite another to die for something you know to be a lie. The fact that many disciples died painful deaths after a duration of being tortured without recanting testifies to the fact that they knew what they preached was true and that their leader was alive. If they had made the whole thing up, they surely would not have willingly died in such ways, or at very least would have recanted during torture. Plain and simple, it honestly makes no sense for the disciples to have lied about Christ's resurrection. Anglican bishop and New Testament scholar N.T. Wright once wrote, "We know lots of other messianic and similar movements in the Jewish world roughly contemporary with Jesus. In many cases, the leader died a violent death at the hands of the authorities. In not one single case do we hear the slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming that their hero had been raised from the dead. They know better. Resurrection was not a private event. It involved human bodies. There would have to be an empty tomb somewhere. A Jewish revolutionary whose leader had been executed by the authorities and who managed to escape arrest himself had 2 options: give up the revolution or find another leader. We have evidence of people doing both. Claiming that the original leader was alive again was simply not an option, unless, of course, he was." After taking this all in, now compare the resurrection eyewitnesses to those eyewitnesses who claim to see ghosts, the Loch Ness Monster, Bigfoot, and have been abducted by aliens. Were these other witnesses originally doubters too? Doubters like Thomas, who wanted to see hard evidence himself before he would believe? Doubters as extreme as Saul, who would arrest and jail you for believing the myth? Did these other witnesses do complete 180s, switching from die-hard doubt to die-hard commitment to spreading the truth? Would these other many witnesses have claimed such things if there were no fame and money to be gained from it? Would these other witnesses have maintained their testimony after jail and torture and be willing to die for the thing they witnessed? This is what separates the story of Christ from accounts of ghosts and aliens. Now, of course, we all wish we could have more compelling evidence, right? A photograph, a video, something we could see and analyze for ourselves. But as said before, the resurrection occurred 2,000 years ago, meaning that the evidence is only limited to what was possible at that time. And when we consider this, we see that if the story of Christ is true, all forms of evidence we would expect to find are there. Multiple eyewitness accounts with slightly different details from doubting people who radically transformed their lives immediately afterwards and were willing to be put to death for something they knew to be true. With all things considered, the events recorded in the Gospels make much more sense if the resurrection did indeed happen.